Elizabeth, you're still on mute.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm greeting you all from the nice, beautiful weather of the Western Cape. It's very nice out there. We will start shortly. I just need to check if my guests and the presenters are all here before we start with the session for today. Just want to see here. Is Paul in the meeting? And Rogers, are you here?
Yes, Madam Chair, I am here.
Oh, thank you very much. Rogers, are you here?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Then we can officially kick off so that we don't waste more of the minutes, so we can have engaging discussions later on. I'm going to record the session, and I believe that everyone who is here is consenting to that.
Recording in progress.
Again, good morning, and thank you for registering and wanting to participate in this year's, our first inaugural Learning Analytics Special Interest Group webinar since the launch of the SAAIR Special Interest Group in April this year. And from the University of the Western Cape, as we are assisting with the hosting of the webinar, we also want to welcome everyone for getting to the call and registering and being part of this. We are expecting about more than 140 participants, but we will see when time goes if the number will increase as well. So far, we have about 49 participants. So without wasting any further time, the session for today is about learning analytics on the African continent in the nexus of resisting data colonialism and improving teaching and learning. And we do have two presenters with us today that will share the research that they have been doing in this area as well. And we also did invite a couple of people to be part of the panel discussion, but load shedding and personal issues come and interfere with everything else. So today we are only having one person for now who has confirmed, but I will check in the chat if Rashna is also part of the meeting, and she will also join in the discussion of in the panel discussion. And if not, then we will open up for everyone to have a discussion. And yeah, so how the meeting will progress today, please make sure that your video remains switched off. Only the presenters can put on their videos as they do the presentation. And also you can put on your video if you want to ask questions or you want to give a comment to the proceedings as well. Make sure that you keep your microphones muted at all times so that we can eliminate the distractions and the disturbances so that the video can be clearer and everybody can hear what the presenters are talking about. Again, we welcome you to freely use the chat function to put or place any comments on any moment of wow that you will get from the presentation, also from the discussion, so that we can keep this engagement live as possible. And also, if you have a question, Bradley Kumalo is on the meeting with us, will help me monitor the chat function so that we can address all the questions that you may have placed in the chat. During the question and answer, please raise your hand using the participant. There is a functionality to raise your hand so that we can recognize you. But if you don't know how, there is no problem. You can put in the chat that you want to raise your hand and we can recognize you from there as well. like I said, the recording already, if you don't consent, hard luck. We already kicked off the recording, so it will be shared with all the registered participants at the end of the sessions later today or tomorrow. So the moment that we all have been waiting for, let me introduce to you the two speakers for today that are going to give us a brief in terms of the work that they have been doing. So first, I'm introducing you to Prof. PaulPrinsloo, who is the research professor in an open distance learning ODL in the College of Economics and Management Sciences at UNISA. His background includes the field as diverse as theology, art history, business management, online learning, religious studies. Paul is an established researcher and has published numerous articles in the field of teaching and learning, student success in distance education context, learning analytics, curriculum development. His research focuses on the collection, analysis, and use of student data in the learning analytics, graduate supervision, and digital identity. This was not me, this is what Paul said. He was born curious and in trouble. Nothing has changed since then. I hope still is like that, Paul. The next person who will be joining Paul in the discussion is Dr. Rogers Kalisa. Congratulations, Rogers, for your completion on your doctoral degree that was awarded last month. Rogers is a postdoctoral research fellow in the learning analytics in the Department of Education at University of Oslo in Norway. He recently completed his doctoral research, which focused on using learning analytics, in particular Learning Analytics Dashboard, as a tool to support teachers in making data-informed learning design decisions in blended learning environments. He is also interested in mobile learning, virtual reality, and multimodal learning analytics. His research utilizes network approaches such as social, epistemic neural networks, and automated discourse analysis to make sense of student data generated from the online learning environment, and how it relates to teachers' intended pedagogical objectives. He currently serves on the executive committee of the SAAIR, which is the Society of Learning Analytics and Learning Analytics Research, and he was elected as a student member. And he co-leads the SAAIR Special Interest Working Group. And together with Paul, Rogers, and Paul have established the network for the African continent. And I hope they will share that with us. I'm going to hand over to you, Paul and Rogers. Also, before I forget, you will have 30 minutes for your presentation, and then we can open it up to the panel discussions if our panel members are part of the proceedings. But if not, then we're going to open it up for question and answer from everyone in the floor. But over to you for now. Take us away. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Namaste, especially for Ramesh that's joining us, and Salam Alaikum, and Tobela, and I think that is about, and Goeiemorgen, that's my home language. I'm just sharing my screen with you, and then getting to the PowerPoint, and then we should be well underway. Can I just get confirmation that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. It needs to be in the presentation mode. Thank you. We can see it.
Great. Thank you also for Rogers sharing the stage with me. As Elizabeth said, the title of the presentation is sort of a provocation or an open space, an invitation for conversation on learning analytics on the African continent in the nexus of, on the one hand, resisting data colonialism and improving teaching and learning. So we just acknowledge that the We don't own the copyright of any of the images used in this presentation, and we acknowledge the original copyright and licensing regime of every image used. And this presentation, excluding the images, is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Just an overview of the presentation. So as introduction, we want to set the scene that African higher education in the nexus between using student data to improve teaching and learning, and then relying on commercial providers for digital infrastructure skills and analysis. And there's some opportunities and there's problems in that space. We also want to share with you our research, what is currently known about learning analytics on the African continent in terms of institutionalization of learning analytics and the protection of student data privacy. Then to the second half would be African higher education as data frontier, implications of data colonialism, and learning analytics as colonization. And that's an interesting space and proposition and provocation. And then we conclude with asking the question, how do we improve teaching and learning using student data and resist data colonialism and resist colonizing students' data lives? So just as an introduction, so we cannot and should not ignore the legacy of colonialism on Africa as a continent, and then coloniality as ever present. And these authors, Mignola and Kujano and many others, propose that coloniality is a current phenomenon. It has never stopped. So the second point is African higher education is increasingly becoming digitized and datafied. It's transforming institutions in terms of digital infrastructures. It's transforming the skill sets required from staff and students. It's changing not only how we talk about teaching and learning, but also how we, for example, evaluate teaching and learning. The data we use to evaluate both, and in fact, what controls or owns teaching and learning. And I think that's very important in this conversation this morning. So as African higher education becomes digitized and datafied, it essentially changes the ballgame. The third point, very few higher education institutions have the digital infrastructures, the skills and know-how to optimize the ethical collection, analysis, and use of student data. And as such, African higher education is not only vulnerable, but with a danger of being exploited again and colonized. And then learning analytics may then serve to expand this colonization by colonizing students' learning journeys and data lives. So that is a broad introduction, that we accept coloniality as ever present, that as we become digitized and datafied, it transforms everything, and that African higher education is not prepared for the changes that are coming, and it leaves us vulnerable to commercial enterprises, and that we actually may become part of a broader colonization, and that we start colonizing students' learning journeys and data lives. So this is just where all started. For those who are new to the learning analytics domain, this was the first definition put forth in 2011 at the first Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. The definition said, learning analytics is a measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learning and their context for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. But then very interesting, the second quote is from that webpage of the first conference, where it says, learning institutions and corporations make little use of the data learners throw off. And that's a very particular, interesting statement, that we just pick up things that the learners throw off. It doesn't belong to them, so there's no harm done. And in an age where educational institutions are under growing pressure to reduce costs and increase efficiency, analytics promises to be an important lens through which to view and plan for change at course and institutional levels. Two interesting things there. So it has the learner at stake. It attempts to improve teaching and learning. There's an inherent assumption that the learners just throw off data, so there's no harm done, and it serves to reduce the cost and increase efficiency. Having said that, then it brings us to what we currently know about learning analytics and student data privacy. on the African continent. Rogers and I were privileged to do this research, and we published 2 articles. Over to you, Rogers.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the great introduction and presentation of the current state, or giving a great introduction about the learning analytics and data on the African continent. And as Paul said, I'll be providing a quick overview of some of the work we have been working on in as far as learning analytics on the African continent is concerned. The work behind this, as Paul said, we have been interested in finding out how do we actually start a discussion of learning analytics on the African continent. And as part of this work, we decided to start from making a baseline study, or kind of a scoping study, to know actually what's happening and what kind of work is being done by researchers on the African continent. So that gives us a good background of where to start and how we can actually move forward. So the first thing we did was to do a scoping review to first of all understand what is the current kind of understanding of learning analytics in the African context. And using a systematic a scoping review study, next slide, Paul, we looked at studies that are using learning analytics, and then of course we only included papers that are published at least in a peer-reviewed journal or conference proceeding, and at least published in English. So we didn't include papers, for example, reporting on educational data mining. We'll have a discussion about this and how these things differ. And then papers reporting on learning analytics conducted in or directed into mentioning learning analytics in Africa. So if they were not mentioning that in particular, then we're not actually including those articles. So in the process, we had a range of studies. We mainly used Scopus, because Scopus has so many scientific data sets, and then Web of Science, and then through that we did a lot of screening, and in the end, without taking much time, we ended up with only 15 studies. And as I'm going to summarize on the next slide, Paul. So what did we find in these studies? So we realized that South Africa, as you see, we had 15, but almost 13 or 10 studies were almost coming from South Africa, and countries like Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, and Kenya. There were a few studies represented there. And in terms of the kind of data that researchers were using, we realized that most of the studies were based on data like surveys or data from observation, documents that's like conceptual studies that are not empirical. Others used interviews, and then others used some data from assessments. So maybe quiz or data from LMSAs. And then getting into target group, we realized that the studies so far there are mainly focused on teachers and researchers. And if I say target group, it's like when you do a learning analytics study, who are the target? Who is the target individuals? Who are the target stakeholders that you wish the kind of learning analytics to address? So we realize that most people or most researchers are looking at studies that actually benefit researchers, or providing them insights about what's happening about students learning, or teachers. Less focus on students so far, and of course others addressing policymakers, learning designers, student advisors, and technical personnel, which is kind of also a common, related kind of trend in the broader learning analytics community all over the world, as we're going to see. Next. So the key findings from this study, we realized that learning analytics on the African continent is still in its infancy, as we say, 15 studies only. That means it's just starting. And the deep analysis in this study, we realized that there could be a connection between the lack of internet penetration, of course, and the content. There is an increasing, of course, penetration of internet, but it is not that much compared to the global north, for example. And then the level of digitization and datification of teaching and learning in African higher education. Because when you talk about learning analytics, we collect learning analytics primarily from using learning management systems or other forms of data systems or platforms. And because this is still low, this is the use of LMSAs and other technical systems in Africa is still limited. That means the progress of learning analytics is also slightly limited from that perspective. And also we saw some kind of trend of using more educational data mining approaches, which we are going to highlight. Like, it's more based on kind of business intelligence. So you collect data to see how many students are enrolled, but not specifically for using the insights to inform teaching or learning. So that's a different kind of mindset about data. So learning analytics is mainly for learning. I mean, we analyze and we collect data, and we analyze it and report it to stakeholders like teachers or students, mainly to inform teaching and learning. But the education data mining perspective is more from a more academic analytics perspective, or a more business intelligence perspective, where we collect a lot of data, but maybe report it to administrators to inform decisions about what kind of courses are doing better and which kind of courses are bringing more money. So we saw some researchers taking that perspective, but also not primarily from an education perspective. And as I said, the current research is mainly from South Africa. When you look at the African context, and also conceptual, that means we don't have so many empirical studies at the moment, and ethical issues are foregrounded in much of the learning analytics research. This could possibly be because of Paul's influence as well, because I think you have been so much represented in the learning analytics on the African continent, and having a primary focus of ethics. I think this has also pushed a lot of research towards this side. And the data sources, as I said, is more secondary sources. So this collides with the conceptual nature of the studies, meaning that we need more empirical kind of studies. But a good thing as well we saw was, when you looked at the trend, we also saw a gradual increase in the publications. So when you look at from 2018 until now, and representation at SOLA, the numbers are still small, but I think there is a kind of a gradual increase towards that end. Next slide. So moving forward from this study, from the scoping review study, we realized that yes, most of the studies published by the Global North, of course, and then we need to get into details as researchers from the Global South, of Africa in particular, to see how do we bring our voices into the discussion of learning analytics on the global scale, and also how do we enforce learning analytics in our own institutions. I think one thing is to get into more applied studies, because learning analytics implementation is sometimes can be expensive, especially on scale at institutions. So that means we need to get into applied studies, because with these kind of studies we can actually justify and show what's the importance and what's the value added in applying learning analytics research, and possibly institutions and funders will be able to say, okay, then this is viable in terms of investment. If we don't do that, possibly it's not very easy for us to convince our administrators, and already institutions are stretched financially. So we need to get into studies that actually showing the impact. What's the added value in terms of teaching and learning outcomes. And you can also do baseline and design-based studies to benchmark stakeholder interests, because implementing learning analytics is a team effort. It's hard for you as a researcher or as an individual teacher to just take on learning analytics on an institution. That means if we get into baseline studies, find out what the stakeholders need, what do the administrators need, what do the teachers need, what do the students need, what are the IT people interested in, and what are the resources available. So with the design-based study, we can actually map this, relate this to theory, and then be able to run learning analytics studies, and also build infrastructure when everybody's on board. So I think if we do this, there is a possibility that learning analytics in African institutions can actually be better supported, and also get support from the administrators and everyone who is involved. And also combined effort among researchers on the African continent. I think that it helps us to bring together different skills. Learning analytics is very interdisciplinary. So at some point you may find that you don't have all the resources needed from a technical perspective to actually conduct good learning analytics studies. And I think moving forward, and also for the networks we're trying to build, I think this will be critical to see who can do what and how we then come together to actually enforce the field of learning analytics. So that was the first study. And then that was mainly to map what is happening on the African continent. And then we moved a little bit further into one of the aspects that's actually affecting learning analytics everywhere, not just in Africa, but also getting back to the title of the talk about data colonialism and how learning analytics implementation. Before we think about it, we also need to think about ethics. We need to think about privacy. And before we address such kind of aspects, maybe it's a bit hard to actually implement learning analytics. So we conducted a study which was published in the British Journal of Education Technology earlier this year on what are the opportunities, challenges, and implications for learning analytics in terms of data privacy. So to address this, we mapped existing legal frameworks approaching personal data protection in Africa. And then we looked at the framework, the current legal frameworks, and how the effect or the implications on learning analytics. And we're looking at if it's existing or it's not existing, or the state of how different countries look at data privacy and the legal frameworks in place. How do these actually impact and influence the way learning analytics can be conducted, and how can this affect the future progress and or even be an opportunity for the future of learning analytics on the continent. So the same approach like the previous study. Next slide. We collected different regulatory frameworks through different websites. So as you can see here, we used 6 main websites: Data Protection Africa, Research East Africa, Africa ICT Policy Database, and Privacy International, and then Privacy Perspective, and then United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So these different sources were giving us information about the current state of the different regulatory privacy frameworks on the African continent, and we use them to report and get data on from the different countries that were represented from these sources. So some of the results we found, for example, in terms of privacy regulation. So we had 4 main categories where we had no legislation but no data on enforcement, legislation but not enforced, and then legislation unenforced. So those are the main kind of patterns we saw when we did the analysis of the data framework. So some countries had no legislation at all. For example, Mozambique, they didn't have a particular legislation on this personal data regulation. Namibia, the same. They have some aspects, of course, mentioned, for example, in the Constitution. The same with Tanzania and Egypt. They have something, but it's under review. But it's not like a specific standalone, explicit kind of regulatory framework. And then we had some countries where there is a legislation, but there is no data on how these are actually being enforced or even implemented. And this could be countries like Malawi, Kenya, Togo, Rwanda. Some had like partial legislations, and then legislation but not enforced. So countries like Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and the rest, they had some legislation, but the enforcement is not very clear. I mean, we tried to look at different sources on how this is done, but explicit information was not easy to find. And then some countries with legislations and enforcement, we found countries like Mauritius, Zambia, Gabon, Burkina Faso, Cape Verde, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Mali, Nigeria, Senegal, Morocco, Tunisia. But one thing to note here is we tried our best to really find out how the things are being enforced. And we can see these categories may not be there is a possibility that some of the aspects overlap here and there, or there's another policy somewhere that's not well represented from online sources, because we're looking at the evidence based on what we could actually find from the different the different data sources. But it's possible some countries, maybe they are enforcing laws, but maybe there is no evidence that could be found. But as from the sources we found, this is what we saw. And that's what we based our findings and analysis on. Next, we also had like the kind of summary from the kind of studies. These papers are quite broad, and you're welcome to have a detailed read about these. Overall, we found that 14 out of 32 African countries distinguish between personal data and sensitive personal data, and then several countries prohibit automated data collection and processing. That's a bit interesting. It was very interesting because if you prohibit, for example, automated data collection, when we talk about learning analytics, it's mainly based on actual automated systems. You have students using data and then using a learning management system, and then in some way data is automatically collected from this kind of system. So with prohibiting data collection, then the question is, how do we actually do learning analytics? At least if we are to use systems that are automated. And then some countries like Niger, Benin, Gabon, and the rest, they mention regulations pertaining to the interconnection of personal data, which is a bit interesting. And then 10 countries had no requirements on the notification of security and breaches. As we said, we did our best, but we couldn't find some of these details. And then some countries actually allow cross-border transfer of data, which is also interesting because I can say, using the GDPR perspective from Europe and how we struggle actually to do cross-border transfer of data, how if you are collaborating with people on different outside the EU, how that is a challenge. We realize that it's actually a positive thing if there is cross-border transfer of data, because that also allows collaboration among researchers and sharing all this different kind of information. And then 14 countries prohibit personal data sharing. Of course, that is like a kind of a contradiction between cross-border transfer of data and then prohibition of personal data sharing. But that's for researchers, it's something to think about. Okay, if we can have data transferred, but what kind of data do we actually transfer? It's if personal data is actually do we need it for learning analytics purposes? It's about being more inquisitive and knowing what kind of data do we collect and what kind of data do we actually need for learning analytics purposes. So we drew some main conclusions from this study, and we can say, even when there are no national legal protection of personal information, higher education has a fiduciary and moral obligation to protect students' privacy. So some countries are still quiet about explicit regulations, but I think as higher education institutions, of course, they have a duty to protect students' privacy. And we realize that when we are doing learning analytics research, we usually use platforms or systems that are provided by third parties, but it's very key as researchers to see that we are explicit about the service level agreements. What kind of data are you collecting and how are you actually sharing it? Because that's very important if we are to protect student privacy and not just take away our data. I think Paul will be talking more about this. And then common data sharing frameworks to facilitate cross-border transfer. That's also very important. As we said, if we are to continue research and share with different researchers, we need to have common data sharing frameworks. We need to know what do we do if we want to share data in different contexts. And then need for empirical studies on data privacy in education. We have started this. I think some of our work, we have talked to some of the higher education experts, but I think we need to do more empirical studies. We can be at a student level. What do students think about this? Just like I saw in the chat one saying, yes, the institutions have the fiduciary duty and moral obligation to protect students' privacy, but do they do it? That's the question. Possibly they have all the documents that actually highlight this information about, oh, you need to protect this info, you need to protect students' data. But maybe there is a lot of some students don't really care much about this. During one of our interviews with higher education experts, with Paul, we sent a paper to LAC, possibly it will come out soon. Some people are saying you could go on a street and you find, for example, a student examination sheet, which is not supposed to be even given out to anybody with their names, and they use it to wrap food or bread on the street. So that's some kind of aspects that we need to pick out as institutions, like how do we protect student privacy? How do we protect students' information? So those are very important and very interesting aspects. And then developing in-house learning analytics tools. I think it's important to see if we develop tools that are based in our institutions, then it's a way to also deal with these privacy issues with external providers coming in, and we don't have much control over what they can actually provide. And then constant and student involvement in design and implementation of learning analytics, I think, is the key, because the whole thing about privacy, we can talk about having all these clauses during the admission and all these processes, but I think the key is constant and student involvement in the design and implementation of learning analytics. Let us ask students, let us show the value of actually having learning analytics, and this will only be achieved if the students themselves can see the value of collecting their data and having interventions that actually impact their own teaching and learning. I think we'll share some studies about existing efforts on student privacy in higher education institutions, and I think Paul can give more light. I saw a question in the chat about existing efforts. I think there are efforts where different institutions are trying to work with students and different stakeholders on implementing learning analytics in a more privacy or ethical-oriented perspective. So I will leave Paul to continue with the second part of the presentation, and I think we'll have more discussions as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Rogers. Just a side note, just want to put it on record that I wish everyone to have such an amazing research partner like Rogers. Our friendship and our collaboration is really one of the most satisfying experiences in my life as a researcher. So just to recap, so learning analytics as a field, as a practice, and as research area is nascent on the African continent. But there's increasing datafication and digitization, and it raises questions, who's behind this? So towards this latter part of the presentation, we want to ask questions about coloniality, the datafication of higher education, and the implications for African higher education and learning analytics. These are just some of the books that I've read over the last year, if two, that express concerns about what is happening in the field of data. The book there on the left is owned, that we actually, the data that we're working for Facebook, we're working for all the social media companies, and we have entered the phase of new digital serfdom. There's Algorithms of Oppression, an amazing book by Sophia Noble. There's one of the latest one, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for the Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. This book, The Privacy at the Margin, is a wonderful read. It focuses on privacy of vulnerable peoples, people of color in the context of the United States, LGBTQI people, females. So it's really, really excellent read. The second last book on the top is The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. An amazing book to read. Another author that I love in the field is The Data Gaze by David Beer. He's a lovely, lovely scholar. Then Race After Technology, Rua Benjamin. We Are Data. I'm currently busy with that. That's amazing, about the data doubles and how institutions use the data double, automating inequality. Then the other one I'm waiting for to read is Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked. And then this last one is The Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Recolonization of Africa, the coloniality of data. And I think I'll send a copy of that to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg. That is really driving the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So colleagues, there's enough evidence that there are concerns about what is happening. And so if we think of African higher education as data frontier, We have to ask those there, and that is one of the questions that this first book of Jeffrey Balker and Susan Starr ask, and I think one of the most early editions is they ask those who collect and own the data have the power to interpret the data, use the data to tell stories about those whose data are collected, the full circle. And so it's not new, but we forget that those who collect and own the data have the power to interpret the data, use the data to tell stories about those whose data are collected. So somehow I can't tell my own story. The story is told by those that collected my data. Then the second bullet is from David Beer. The data analytics industry seek to intensify and expand into new territories and frontiers. And personally, I find the metaphor of frontier very concerning, and it's used by Zuboff, it's used by David Beer. If we think of slavery, if we think of the conquest of what was known as the Americas and what happened at the frontiers, the forcefulness, the epicidicides, the homicides, the Holocaust that was actually caused onto the world by colonialism. We cannot use the word frontier easily. And David Beer says the data analytics industry seeks to intensify. So where there's already digitalization and datification, these analytics industries try to intensify their efforts, get even more data. But then with regard to the African continent, we have to take cognizance of the fact that they want to expand into new territories and frontiers. And if you think of the African population that is very young, and with the increasing digitization of life on the African continent, Africa is a frontier, is a new frontier. And then this quotation by David Beer, for me, sends shivers down my spine. So what the data analytics industry comes, and they offer higher education institutions a speedy, accessible, revealing, panoramic, prophetic, and smart one-stop solution. So speedy, you don't have to send an email to your statistics department at your institution. With a press of a button, you can get access to the latest, real-time information about your students. It's accessible. You don't need to have a degree or understanding of coding or programming. It's for everyone, is accessible. The most junior lecturer will be able to make sense of the data. It's revealing parts of our students' lives that we didn't know. It's revealing patterns. It's panoramic. There's almost no area of student life that is outside of the data gaze. We not only know what they did last summer, we will almost predict what they will do this summer, which brings us to the prophetic. So panoramic, it gives you from the moment of registration to graduation, it's panoramic, it's prophetic. With multimodal data, we also want to collect data from their phones, from their smartwatches. It's as if we have this data hunger, and of course it's smart. And that is a concern that we have, is that very few African higher education institutions will be able to resist this offer from a data analytics edtech venture if they come and say, we offer you speedy, accessible, revealing, panoramic, prophetic, and smart one-stop solutions. So let's just think about data colonialism. So if we think back to the four key components of historical colonialism, and here I use the work by Colby and Mejijas. So it was about the forceful appropriation of resources. They didn't ask permission, they didn't ask consent, they just came and took what was not theirs. And they justified it by saying it's terra nullius, it doesn't belong to anyone. And that reminds me of the claim in that first definition of learning analytics. It's learners throw off data. So we're not harming anyone. So we just pick up what they left. So the historical colonialism was about the forceful appropriation of resources. And that evolved into highly unequal social and economic relations. So it was not benign. It really had impact that it had structural impact. It was a massively unequal distribution of the benefits of this forced appropriation and the spread of capitalism and white supremacy as ideologies to make all of this seem normal and natural. At least for the global north, it was normal and natural. So data colonialism is concerned with the external appropriation of data on terms that are partially and wholly beyond the control of the person to whom the data belongs relates. Can we just focus for a while on that quote? So Coldry and Mejia say that it's external to us, it's external appropriation of data, and we didn't dictate the terms. While they gave us terms and conditions, we were not involved in the phrasing of the terms and conditions. And so the data are partially or wholly owned beyond the control of the person to whom the data belongs relates. So dimensions of data colonialism is that data is a resource to be mined. There's so many metaphors used with regard to learning analytics. It's a new black oil. It's gold. It is a resource to be appropriate. We pick up the data that students throw off. Is value maximized often in the name of it's good for you. We mean well for your safety and in order to personalize your service. I mean, we get these requests all the time when we subscribe to a digital platform is, if you give us your data, it allows us to optimize our services to you. And this, according to Coldry and Mejia, is the dimension of data colonialism. So we see the rise of new colonial corporations that have, whether it's a metaverse, whether it's Amazon, it is just if there's no end to their power and their reach. It's colonizing social relations, new forms of labor, redefining how we talk about each other, what we know about each other, and what we share with each other. There's this notion that privacy is theft and sharing is caring. So data colonialism, like historical colonialism, changes social relations. It normalizes a new normal, and then it's informed by new colonial ideologies. And this, colleagues, was fascinating for me. I mean, we often think of ideologies in terms of capitalism, in terms of socialism, Marxism, new Marxism, name it. And then Coldry and Mejia proposed that we should talk about the ideology of connection and connectivity, the ideology of datafication, the ideology of personalization, and the inevitability of all of this. And I think if, from a researcher perspective, if there's one aspect of the work of Coldry and Mejia that really fascinate me, it's this one. What is behind this ideology of connection, that everyone should be connected all the time, 24/7, 365 days of the year? The datafication, personalization, and the inevitability of all of this, almost that resistance is futile. This was published for the 4th of October. The whole of the Indian subcontinent's road to new education policy goes through Amazon Web Services. So where a whole subcontinent buys into and almost delegates education to Amazon Web Services. And what does it signify? And then when I read this, it looks like colonialism to me. This is what Ben Williamson says about how Amazon operates in education. As a state-like corporation with international reach and market ambitions, Amazon Web Service is exceeding the jurisdictional authority of policy centers to potentially become the default digital architecture for governing education globally. Isn't that an amazing claim? Just a side note, Audrey Waters was always my go-to person with regard to more critical perspectives on EdTech. And she has decided to fall silent and to pursue a more personal life. If you want to follow someone on Twitter and he's writing, please follow Ben Williamson. So colleagues, just look at that quote from Ben Williamson. So what happens when MS Office becomes the default digital architecture for governing higher education in South Africa? What happens when Teams become the default digital architecture? What happens when Amazon, what happens when Google Classrooms in the South African context become the default digital architecture for governing education? We have to ask these questions. So if we think of the implications, our teaching and learning spaces no longer belong to us. We rent spaces from Moodle. We rent spaces from Blackboard, Amazon, Pearson's, and Google in order to teach and learn. Isn't that amazing? There's this whole discourse of the platformatization of education, where we rent spaces on platforms while we used to own the buildings in which we taught in face-to-face education. Now we rent spaces from these providers. The second point, learning management system providers have changed how we see and talk about teaching and learning. Platform providers determine how we teach. There's some things you can do on an LMS, and there's some things you can't. Platform providers determine what we value as engagement and learning, how we are evaluated as teachers, and what counts as teaching and what counts as learning. So I always wonder if Paulo Freire would have designed the learning management system, what would it have looked like? And I don't think it's almost a contradiction in terms, but we forget that we're living in a house that we haven't designed. We didn't determine how many windows, how many doors, how big the classroom, how the learning management platform provider has made these choices for us. And then we talk about teaching and learning in terms of what they provide us. We now talk about teaching and learning in the language they provide us. So if higher education is owned by cloud service providers, what are the implications? What are the implications? So I hope to have proposed that we have reason to concern that we're teaching in rented spaces. But now if I must bring it to learning analytics, and that's part of the project with Rogers and myself, is we collect and sort selected data from students' learning journeys, make evaluations about their engagement, their learning, their progress, and we use our interpretation of their data to tell them how they are doing and what their chances are of succeeding based on the data we selected from their learning journey. There's almost two circles in that one sentence, and that reminds me of one of the earlier slides. So it's selected data, and we make evaluations about students' engagement from that selected data, their progress, and we use our interpretation of that selection to tell them how well they are doing and what their chances are of succeeding based on the data we selected from their learning journeys. I must still sleep about that sentence. Then the second thing is, how do we prevent learning analytics from becoming voiceovers of their learning and missing the richness and the complexities of their learning, their aspirations, and the messiness of their lives? And this is not a proposition, colleagues, that we should gather more data, that we should go to their mobile phones and follow them to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. God behold. So how do we prevent learning analytics from becoming voiceovers of their learning? That if we tell them, this is my dashboard of their learning, will they recognize themselves? Will they recognize the richness and the complexities of their learning, their aspirations, and the messiness of their lives? So conclusions, Madam Chair and everyone. So how do we resist? There's a continuous tense there that shouldn't have been there. How do we resist data colonialism in our dealings with platform providers? How do we negotiate control in a building not owned by us? For if you have ever moved into a building renting a flat or a room, you will know how difficult it is to actually change the painting or to change the number of windows in that room. So how do we negotiate control in a building not owned by us? The second point is, how do we teach in these rented spaces? How do we claim back spaces for learning and the ways we talk about learning? Is there a different way of talking about learning that takes us away from sources downloaded, loggings, responses, linkages? And then lastly, and that's a question Rogers and I would love to leave you with, is how do we stop colonizing students' lives as we seek for more and more data to collect? And then the last slide is, Rogers and I started this to just establish expressions of interest of scholars on the African continent that would join an informal network of researchers and scholars and practitioners to help us think through these issues, to help raise awareness, to do collaboration, to apply for funding. So there's such a wide scope. Currently, we have close to 129, I think that's the latest count, of individuals across the African continent that expressed an interest to join this network. Rogers, who's on the executive committee of the Society of Learning Analytics Research, as well as myself, we are going to apply for a special interest group just for this African Network for Learning Analytics Research. It's still in its infant shoes, but please feel free to join us, and there's a link at the bottom, or you can reach Rogers or myself if you want more information. So that's our contact details. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you for sharing, for giving us a space to share our thoughts.
Oh, wow, Paul and Rogers, what an insightful discussions and thought-provoking topics that you came up with, and also just to open our eyes and also make us aware of the work that still needs to happen in the African continent. As when it comes to learning analytics, the journey is still long. There are a couple of comments in the section, and I also want to open it up for comments for people to contribute, because I'm looking at the time as well. So one of the first questions that came about was when Rogers was still doing the presentation, and the question, I will note all the hands. Let me first read all these questions in the chat so that then we don't forget about them. The first question was, did the review look at studies from other global south regions such as Americas and Oceania, and what are the observations thereof? Hold on to that thought. I'll read a couple of questions so that then you are able to answer 2 or 3 questions at times. The other question was, higher education might have a duty to protect student privacy, but do they? That's the question, and hopefully maybe someone also can also answer that question. And the other comment came from Dalani. He's asking, or he's commenting, and he says, I wonder if there are works on higher education deal with student data or works on how higher education deal with student data and what protection they have in place. And the last one was just a comment around the regulatory requirements by Celia. She is saying the regulatory requirements, for example, criteria and reporting to DHET and Council of Higher Education in South Africa would mostly determine the kind of data collection, but the need for a feedback into the enhancement of teaching and learning should be considered. I'm going to stop right there and hand over to you and Roger to comment on some of those questions asked.
Rogers, you're welcome to go first.
Of course, I'll take the easy ones and then I leave the hard ones for you. Yeah, so thank you so much for the great questions again, and thanks for the insightful presentation. I think I'll first of all talk about the scope of the reviews that we had. So for the here, of course, in the discussion, we talk about the global south, global north, but we can say for the review that we covered, we restricted that to studies in Africa, on the African continent in particular. So there is a study that looked at learning analytics on from the global south in particular, but it was, I think, a chapter in a handbook. I don't know whether, Paul, you were part of that, but I think they were covering some information about what's happening in South America and, I mean, Oceania, if we are talking about Australia included, there is a lot of work there. I think that's one of the most powerful areas where analysis is being done. But I think for this work, we mainly focused on Africa. And I can say besides the Australia, there's some work going on in countries like Chile, and because of some individual researchers trying to pull efforts, just like what we are doing in Africa, but I think it's still limited as well, just like in an African context. And then there was a question on, there is a question, you didn't highlight it, Elizabeth, but was on, it's an important research question, and do we have any suggestions on what kind of research questions postgraduate students can actually address or study? I can say this is a young field. Of course, we are going into 12 years now. It is still exciting. So most of the things are almost open there, and there are so many aspects to look at, and depending on the context of the university and where you're working, because what's important is what kind of environment you're working with and what kind of data are you having, and then what are the possibilities for the different researchers. For example, my researcher was working on supporting teachers to get data from learning management systems like Canvas. So it depends on if you have, for example, data from a learning management system, it's possible to, for example, get data from that and then study whether data from that can inform students' feedback, or it can inform students' learning, or it can. So it really depends on the infrastructure available. Currently, I'm starting my postdoc research at the University of Oslo, and we are going to be looking at using multimodal learning analytics. So for that one, you can use sensors like eye trackers or videos, audios, and social badges to collect data about the heart rate. I think Paul was talking about all these fantastic and very crazy kind of ways of collecting data, but there are so many aspects, and we are happy to share more literature through the network, and we can show you the different arenas to help you actually explore different aspects. If Paul, you want to continue with some, I can jump in with other questions if you want to.
No, thank you, Rogers. There's an interesting question about how do higher education institutions protect student privacy. Very interesting, just from the case of the University of South Africa, who pays my salary so far. It is that they on the main screen of the institution, if you scroll down below, almost at the bottom, there is a privacy statement. And when you click on there, then you find a reference to the Protection of Privacy or Personal Information Act in the context of South Africa. And then it takes you to the side of the data that UNISA collects. So, and I think there's a dominant discourse in the South African context that we are covered by law. We are mandated in terms of efficiency that we may collect student data if we want to increase student efficiency of teaching and learning. But if something is legal, it doesn't make it ethical. And I think there's something there. The other thing about one of the first universities that have designed a policy on the ethics of learning analytics was the Open University of the UK, who was one of the first to adopt such a policy. I will post a link into the chat room just after this. So have a look. I still think it was groundbreaking at that stage. And since then, there's a number of institutions that have policies and have code of practices. but it does not necessarily prevent harm. And that brings me to the second last point is, how would students know that they are harmed? And I think that's interesting. I'm doing collaborative research with a colleague in Madrid. What is harm in analytics? And when will a student know that he or she has been harmed? Maybe they would never know, except for the fact that they may not know is what recourse would they have if they feel they have been excluded from resources, or if they have been defined as an at-risk student and that limited their chances or their access to resources. How will they confront an institution? Do they have access to legal resources to actually fight the battle? So we have to think of harm. What does harm in learning analytics look like? And often harm and lack of privacy and all of that is sort of hidden. Then Laura posted some great resources in the chat. Please follow them, Laura, and thank you for your input. Just with regard to research questions, one of the things that keep fascinating me in the South African context is that students haven't picked up the fight. It's as if there's bread and butter issues, there's fees, roads must fall, fees must fall. There's other more important questions. So why haven't the student activist population taken up the call for more privacy or for insight of how they are classified? So Laura, that's a fascinating research project to find out why don't we see activism, why don't we see concerns from the student body. And then there's a range of other concerns. And I think Rogers and I are planning to open a Slack channel for this Africa network, as well as a weblog that we can share questions that can be a wonderful resource for postgraduate students. I think that is from my side. I haven't had time to engage with all the questions. Elizabeth, please.
No problem. I will assist you on that front. At the moment, I've got 3 hands that have been up, and I think by now they are very tired. They will be dropping them. I will recognize all of the 3. Please, can I ask that you keep it short and summarized so that we can allow for more engagement as well. Mzondeni, you first, then Charles, and then followed by Les. If you have a question, then after that, they will answer the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Paul, it's always great listening to you speak. Really, it's a lot of insights to take here. And thanks, Rogers. Unfortunately, I missed your part of the presentation. Colleagues, I just want to ask now, as the vanguard of innovation, as well as data management in the university, it seems as if these big corporates and data, which lead into data colonization, are the necessary evil, much like rankings. If you want real-time data, real analysis, projections, scenarios, they are the to go to, and one is always faced with the ethical use of that data, and you never know what other additional analysis is being done in the background with your data and your student data. Would you advocate for more local development of solutions? And if not, in the engagement with these big corporates, would it be necessary, probably maybe as a country or as a sector, to develop guidelines of engagement which become part of the SLAs that we would sign with these corporates? Thanks.
Okay. Charles?
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent presentation from Paul and Rogers. I think it's really something serious to chew on, especially when I see the issue of data colonization and datafication as such. My worry here is that, I see a real need from the presentation that we need to Africanize the entire digitalization agenda on the African continent, and so that we don't play play ourselves into the hands of these continents or superpowers that are driving the global digitalization agenda. And clearly, I don't see any concerted effort from African leaders, on the continent. I.e., look at most of these analytics tools we are using are foreign, not developed from the African context. And in a certain way, we deploy these data solutions on the servers and services run by these, superpowers that are dictating the entire agenda when it comes to analytics and digitalization for that matter. So essentially, we are playing ourselves into the hands of these superpowers, and which is what is being rehashed by Paul and Rogers. And it's very critical. And my worry is that there is no concerted effort from our leaders. My question is, are they really fully aware of the future implications? If they are we finding solutions? Because we need to act now. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz? You are muted, Liz.
Sorry, I have a few thoughts and provocations here. The first one is just the narrative around learning analytics in Africa is we've got to catch up. What are we trying to catch up with? What is this thing that we are trying to achieve? And is that something that is African or required in Africa? What do we actually require here? And then also when we talk about the colonization, it's not countries that are colonizing Africa. It's corporations. And we're the next frontier, and I know you're averse to using the term necessarily, although you have it in the title of one of your articles. But it is a violence in terms of this is naked, barren land that hasn't been milked yet. And again, there's a power disparity between these two things. But if we look at data now, humans are commodified as data. And how do we prevent the sort of Saartjie Baartman, the Hottentot Venus sort of occurrence, which happened before, where with a handful of colorful beads, someone is sold into Europe to be part of a freak show and poked and prodded by people? How does our data, our humanity, or much of it that is captured in that data, when it is housed outside of the country, how does that not become part of the freak show of analytics? So I know that sounds highly philosophical, but I think this is something we have to engage with because it's techno-political and we keep focusing on the technological side, but not the political part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul and Rogers, any comments?
Oh my goodness. Thanks, Danny, Charles, and Liz. I'm going to venture some thoughts and then Rogers can join me. But I would like Laura also to join the conversation. She's my mentor and she's very wise. And so, Danny, you use the word necessary evils. Will local developments really make a difference? My recent research into learning analytics as part of a data ecology, which suggests that data will leak out of whatever we have, whether it's locally produced or whether it's hosted by Amazon. You cannot keep data behind a firewall. A student can take a screenshot of this presentation that was on the servers of the University of the Western Cape, and it's out. So almost my gut feeling is that while we should not stop protesting this colonization, we should increase the awareness of those that are colonized. to make more conscious decisions. So just shortly, Sundeni, I don't think there's almost a way out. We cannot develop a Microsoft Office. We cannot, if the whole rest of the world is using Microsoft Office, if the rest of the world is using Zoom like we're using here, what alternatives do we have? I'm not sure. I would almost say that while we fight that fight, we should raise the awareness on individual level, because in a data ecology, it leaks out. Okay. And yes, of course, service level agreements will be a good place to start. When last did you engage with your service level agreement with Moodle or with Blackboard or whatever platform you use? Charles, then the concerted effort. You raised a question that Sundeni also raised. Do we really have a choice? Would local be better? I'm not sure, because capitalism, as there's an ideology of extraction of value that is almost part of human nature. So I'm not sure, Charles, whether yes, we need more laws, but we need enforcement. So I'm rambling. Liz, so very pertinent question. What are we trying to catch up to? I firmly believe, and maybe I should repeat this. I firmly believe that in my student group that I'm teaching online, there's some data that really allows me to teach better. I inform them what data I collect. I inform them what decisions I make on what data, and having access to their data really helps me teach better, really helps me support them better. So I do think that's why I'm still in the learning analytics community, because I really believe that access to student data can help me teach better. Let me put that on record. So I don't think we should try to catch up with the global north. We should say, what data do we need in order to teach better on a very, very local level? And then the interesting challenge on the African continent is a lot of our data is still analog. So how do we balance analog and digital? And then let's just your final point. Yes, Sarki Bartman and Hottentot Venus. For me, I've used this image in a previous presentation. That is what we actually have when we look at students' data. We export our students' data to become part of a freak show overseas. So Rogers, please join the party.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for the insights. I think I want to repeat what you talked about, but there's some other more practical issues that were raised by some people. I think Ramesh talked about the skills among researchers and teachers in using analytics and how that can be dealt with. And I can say from a research perspective, as I highlighted in my discussion, I think working as a team, working with different researchers from different contexts and different disciplines is one way to start with that. You have some data, you don't know how to do with that, what to do with the data. Just working with other people having different skills is a good way to start, at least from a research perspective. And when it comes to the teachers, the practitioners, it's an effort, which is not just from the African perspective, but even here, like these European universities, they have a lot of money, but when these tools come in, it's about the simplicity of the tools and the guides and how the tools are designed. So it's data literacy is a challenge everywhere, but it starts with the design of a tool. When you design a tool at an institution, as I talked about using participatory approaches and learning analytics, we're talking about human-centered learning analytics. Let us develop the tools with the people who are supposed to use them so that they are part of the process and they can define the kind of features they actually need. So I think that's one way to go about that. And maybe to link that to the discussion about the foreign tools and using tools from international corporations. I mean, there may not be an easy fix about that, but still I think taking a human-centered learning analytics approach where we develop tools, not getting off the shelf tools. Of course, we can say financially it could be expensive, but if we start with our own researchers and the stakeholders and define what kind of problems we have and what kind of data we have and how we can actually design systems within our own context, I think it's still possible. Things like dashboards can be developed based on systems that are housed within institutions, and in some way it can protect privacy somehow, even though these are also part of the larger systems, but I think it's one way to deal with that. Chimeka, you talked about interest in getting postdoc opportunities. We can say, as part of the network, things we want to do is to share information about existing opportunities, either in learning analytics or related fields. So we'll do that every time we send out updates and in our future communication. So we usually get information about existing positions in the that are connected to the learning analytics, for example. So we are always happy to share that information, and I think we'll continue doing that. But you can also get in touch with Paul. I think he usually has a few postdocs, so you can have a chat to see what kind of possibilities are possibly there.
Also checking the time, always timekeeper. I'm always aware of that. Paul, I also want to bring you to one of the discussions that we had previously, I think, offline. And this might highlight the fact that why learning analytics probably is not well researched in South African context, because it might be linked as well to the literacy in terms of what learning analytics is all about, and the difference between educational data mining or data mining activities as opposed to learning analytics. I know that you were also part and of the people who developed the course. Maybe you can also elaborate on that for people who also want to know more about the learning analytics field, how they can upskill themselves through that the course that you guys develop. You can share more details about that. I also recognize Liz and Mutondedi. Please feel free, also other people, if you also have burning questions or comments, feel free to ask and raise your hand. Yes, Paul?
Okay, thanks, Liz. I just posted the link in the discussion forum. It's a primer that we developed for the Commonwealth of Learning, which is, on the one hand, ironic. There's nothing common about the wealth in the Commonwealth, but it is a very powerful organization. So they asked Sharon Mohammed, myself, to develop a primer, sort of as an introduction course into learning analytics, and there is 2 or 3 chapters on basic tools. So I posted the link there. It's also available as a PDF download that you can download the course, or you can actually do the self-regulated learning route with some activities. It's not the best, but it's a good access and a good overview. And there's several others that I will, if I have time, I will share the links. That's just from my side. I would love to hear what Sundeni and Elizabeth and maybe some others say.
Yes, Les and Sundeni. Les first.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I was just thinking, one of the things that you made mention of is that, sort of the beats that are thrown in front of our faces is that these tools are easy, quick, understandable. Anyone can become a learning analytics expert and use the data. And I would have a counterpoint to this, and I must say, I obviously am very interested in sport learning analytics as part of my research. But if this becomes the case, these tools are easy, but in a sense, it is a black box. Okay, so even if they tell us exactly how Moodle does the analysis, for us to get the information, that information needs to be interpreted. And if it's so quick and easy, even if, as I said, it is published, no lecturer is going to go back and go and see exactly how it took place. What is important wherever a tool is developed may not be important to learning and teaching here. And I think there's very, very big danger in that. I do believe, and I agree, it doesn't make sense to keep trying to develop our own tools. It's costly, it might not work. There is an opportunity for leapfrogging here, but there's a very real danger as well that we need to be aware of.
Louis?
Thanks. I'd like to go as Sundari. Thanks, Chairperson. I'm also quite a bit conflicted here. This is a very provocative topic. There was a question earlier about how will the student know? And Paul, you tried to respond to that by saying you would give them feedback, and you also add that our students here are still a little bit behind, in terms of this. Perhaps we need a disruption, something like this must fall in this space. But I just wanted to add just a comment on that in my view, I think feedback is very, very important. Awareness alone is not enough. Knowledge about this data analysis, just putting it on website, scrolling down there to see what data is used and how it's used is not enough. Collective outcome expectancy is quite impactful when it comes to this kind of work or new ideas, the take-up of new ideas. And colleagues, the more we give feedback to the owners of the data, which are the students, and they can actually see the impact of the analysis that we're doing in their lives, then we will create, more engagement from the student point of view. And those are the ones who can actually help us define how we can do this, especially responding or commenting on what Liz was saying. The more feedback and the more engagement we get from the owners of the data, the more we will be able to understand in the context of an African setup, what kind of data should be collected, how it should be used, and when are we committing violence or unethical conduct. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further comments or questions, I'm checking the chat as well. Thank you for all the resources that have been shared. Please make sure that you keep copy of that, but we will also try and collate all the resources that were shared today and include them in the email so that if you've missed them, then we can include them. Okay, we will solve that error. No problem, Ramesh. We will fix it. If there are no final comments, I'm going to ask Rogers and Paul just to give your last one BFO.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth and everyone. Let's keep thinking, let's keep asking questions, and let's keep protesting and critiquing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Same here. I think it's just encouraging everyone to keep exploring the area, and just like the previous participant, let's involve the people we intend to give the analytics, and I think in the end we'll reduce the resistance and we'll take the field forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you. On behalf of the University of the Western Cape and on behalf of the Executive Committee of the SAAIR, I would like to thank Paul and Rogers for the insightful discussions and presentation and the knowledge that you shared with us. And also I would like to thank all the participants who were here present today to participate and engage, sharing your ideas and comments in the section. Let's keep the conversation going. Paul has shared the link to the African network, and I encourage everyone to also participate. If you are also an SAAIR member, we do have this special interest group that we also want to start building up in support of the African network that Paul have started also, so that we can find common ground in terms of capacity development, research, collaboration, and also how do we make sure that we find resources in terms of funding for those research that we want to undertake, and also increase the research output in terms of this area of learning analytics. I encourage you to also participate in the SAAIR Learning Analytics Special Interest Group, and the link was also shared in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful week until we meet again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.